An analysis of the second coming by William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out, when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, and what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born. Well, this is a very famous poem by Yeats, probably his most famous. I don't really think it's his best. It's one of the best. Somebody said it's a great poem for people who are not really interested in poetry because it's very quotable, and politicians and public people can always quote something from this poem when they want to talk about dire prophecies for the future. It's unusual for Yeats. He didn't write a lot of his poetry in blank verse. Let's say something about the structure before we look at the meaning, because there isn't really a lot to say. It's usually agreed that this is a kind of loose iambic pentameter. We know what an iamb is. An iamb is 1 foot of 2 syllables. Unstressed, stressed, right? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Unstressed, stressed. So it's not very regular as iambic pentameter, turning and turning in the widening gyre. Well, there's no way that's iambic pentameter. Maybe it begins to settle down later. However, we can say about Yeats in general that his rhythms are very unusual, his meters are very unusual, and I feel that critics often call it iambic, often call the rhythm iambic when it isn't really particularly. It's jumping, the rhythm, the meter is jumping around all over the place, and there is nothing very clear. I feel that Yeats most of the time just relied on his ear. He didn't think about whether he was writing iambs or trochees or spondies or dactyls, anapests. He just relied on his ear and saw where it would take him. And this creates a very modern kind of line where it's very difficult to pin down exactly what the meter is a lot of the time. And that's how this is. Critics usually say it's iambic pentameter because they want something simple to hold on to, but I'm not sure it is really. Like a lot of his poetry, it's maybe made up of uneasy iambs, but I think that's possibly just a question of iambic meter being the most natural to the English language, so he just follows his ear and it just turns out to be iambic a lot of the time. So yeah, it's loose. The rhythmic nature is loose. and it's unrhyming. What's particularly striking about this poem is the content, of course, and the imagery. Just before we get onto that, it's worth talking about the two stanzas. So the poem is 22 lines long, and the first stanza is of 8 lines, right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, 8 lines. And then the second stanza is 14 lines. 14 lines. So it has been suggested that it's kind of like the first stanza is the octave or sonnet, which is the first 8 lines, and then the second stanza is basically 14 lines, like a sonnet. Well, I don't know. Interesting, yes, but you would have to say that because there is no rhyming, it's not really similar to sonnets at all. All we can say is that the octave of a sonnet usually sets up the problem, and then there is a resolution in the sestet, or the last 6 lines. Yeah, maybe the first 8 lines here talking about the state of the world. State's the problem for sure, but then there isn't any sestet, so if it's like a sonnet, it just starts again. It's an interesting idea. It's probably not something that Yeats was thinking about particularly. It's just the way it worked out. But it is a rather strange structure with 2 stanzas, one with 8 lines and second with 14. I would say the second stanza with 14 is really a resolution of the first 8 lines, so it doesn't follow the sonnet's structure at all. Let's look at the content. So, yeah, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. So the gyres, Yeats was very interested in the gyres, the spirals, the vortex of history. So in Yeats, when he talks about gyres, it's usually about the circles of history and the way in which we have cycles of history, and one cycle can be very productive and positive, and another cycle can be full of anarchy and misery. It's a little bit like kalpas in Buddhist philosophy. So long, lengthy periods of time, circles of time which repeat themselves, and some are good and some are bad, and you never know which you're going to get born into. In the Buddhist philosophy, they think that if you're born into a time when Buddhist teachings are available, then you're lucky and you've been born into a positive kalpa. Here, I don't know, so perhaps it's similar. You can be lucky or unlucky, be born into a bad cycle of history, or jaya, or a good cycle of history. And it seems that perhaps in this poem, Yeats believes that we are in a bad cycle of history, or something that was good, or at least not too bad, is changing into a new jaya, a new cycle, which is definitely going to be terrible. So the order that comes through civilization is breaking down. There is a falconer with his falcon, and the falcon is no longer paying any attention to him. It's getting further and further away, cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. So there is definitely the idea that an established order is coming to an end, and there is a new apocalyptic period coming along, which is going to be chaotic, anarchic. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. So it's going to be a bloody time, and innocence will be drowned in blood. It sounds horrible. It's worth remembering that this was first published in 1920, so just after the First World War had ended, the most brutal war in history, and just a couple of years before Eliot's Wasteland, which perhaps spoke of similar elements, a breakdown of civilization after a horrible, terrible war. However, it's different here because there is a prophetic nature of Yeats looking to the future, which is not really something Eliot does in The Wasteland. And then it finishes: the best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. This presumably is typical of a time when things are breaking down, when order is breaking down, when civilization is breaking down. The old certainties cannot be relied on it anymore. In those times, people with a chip on their shoulder become particularly influential, and weak-minded people listen to them. The better people, they just keep their own counsel, keep quiet, because everything that's supported their worldview before seems to be disappearing, and they are not really sure what's happening. So the best lack all conviction. So a problem has been stated here in those first 8 lines. Civilization is breaking down. We are entering a new period of anarchy and destruction, when blood will be loosed upon the world and everything that is innocent destroyed. Let's continue then looking at the second stanza, when presumably more information will be given. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. So these lines refer to the book of Revelation, which predicted the second coming of Christ. It's the final book of the New Testament, and it includes images like the riders of the apocalypse and all sorts of strange visions, which are very difficult to interpret. However, the images are very memorable, as the images in Yeats's poem are very memorable. So the second coming, yes, the second coming of Christ, that's what the book of Revelation speaks about, and says that he will come after a long period of dominance by the devil, by Satan. It's different here. It seems that something different to Christ is going to be born. So the result will be different too. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. So Spiritus Mundi was something, for Yeats, was something similar to Carl Jung's archetypes, universal archetypes, the kind of repository of universal symbols and ideas that civilizations partake in. It's a bit more mystical in less psychological in Yeats's case, because it's basically the soul of the universe, the universal soul, and he believed that all symbols and images come from this universal soul, and artists like poets are able to tap into this universal soul better than other people, and that's where they take their inspiration from. And all symbols and images come from the same source. So he is saying then that he is seeing a vision, seeing something from the universal soul, the universal repository of images. So this troubles his sight, and somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. So this is not a Jesus Christ figure coming to save the world. It's something horrible, a terrible vision that's going to bring bloody destruction and misery to everybody. And it's a monstrosity, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, like a sphinx, a terrible sphinx, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, and it's moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. You have the idea of this monstrous thing moving slowly, and it's a great image, the image of the shadows of the indignant desert birds reeling around it. You really get that idea of the kind of vortex of birds swirling around this monstrosity as it moves its slow legs. So this is a vision. This is the creature that is going to be born. Not a Christ figure, but something much more horrible, something evil. The darkness drops again, but now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So the darkness drops again, but he has had a prophetic vision. The writer, Yeats, now I know that 20 centuries, 2,000 years since Christ, of sleep, were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle, that this is a thing that was always going to happen. This was not Christ that was going to come, but this sphinx-like monster. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born. So Bethlehem is the place where Christ was born. It's where the new monstrosity will be born that brings suffering and misery to the world. So the poem seems to exist on the edge of one age, and it's moving into another. So perhaps the last age was not good. Remember, the First World War had just finished. But what will come later is even worse. And it's often said that Yeats was very prophetic here, and he is looking forward to philosophies like fascism and Nazism, and in 1920 he is able to see that things are getting worse, and and in the future unspeakable things will happen when political powers take over the world that have no pity and no morality to guide them, and will just do whatever they want to do. So the poem is enigmatic. It tells you that one age is finishing, which was not particularly good perhaps, and a new age is beginning, which will be even worse, and we can expect all kinds of suffering and misery in the age that is still to come. So it's very pessimistic, it's very depressing. There is little hope. There is no Christ figure who will be coming. It's the opposite, an antichrist figure that will only bring destruction, suffering, and misery to people. Of course, it's full of very memorable phrases. The first one, turning and turning in the widening gyre. Things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. These are all very, very famous lines, which even people who don't know much about poetry are familiar with. Vast image out of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it real shadows of the indignant desert birds. This is a very famous description of the monster that is slouching towards Bethlehem to be born, to bring misery and destruction on the earth. It's a little bit reminiscent of Ozymandias, is it, by Shelley, where he is talking about the desert sands and the Ozymandias, king of kings, who had a sneer of cold command. Just a few. The essential ideas are different, because Ozymandias is about the passing of greatness. This is something entirely different, a prophecy for the future, but I just feel a few of the phrases are a little bit about the desert and the gaze blank and pitiless as the sun. A little bit reminiscent of Ozymandias and his sneer of cold command. Of course, all writers have echoes of other writers in the back of their mind, and that might not be a very important point, but just it's a thought I had, and I think probably there are a couple of echoes of Ozymandias there. So what else? The part about the monster slouching towards Bethlehem to be born is very, very famous. So the poem is probably more meaningful if we know something about Yeats's addiction to theosophy and Madame Blavatsky and the kind of occult world which was so popular at this time. I think a lot of the theosophy of the time was a kind of jumbled bag coming from different sources. Some of it was from Hinduism, some of it from certain arcane Greek ideas, metempsychosis, and the reincarnation of souls. Just to give an idea about this, it's worth remembering that the woman he was obsessed with, Maud Gonne, she had actually gone into the tomb of her dead child with her ex-husband, with whom she had conceived the child, and had sex next to the crypt, so that, in the hope that her next child would be the reincarnation of the dead child. Now, anyone who knows anything about Eastern ideas will know that there is nothing like that coming from Hinduism or Buddhism. Reincarnation, yes, but reincarnation has strict rules according to how it happens and the reasons for it, how people are reincarnated. Nothing about having sex next to a dead body in the hope that the next child that is conceived will be the spirit of the dead child. So that's all a bit spooky, and it's the sort of ideas that Yeats and the people around him had based on this theosophy from Madame Blavatsky was a mixed bag of ideas, and often they were not really very consistent. This poem is full of these occult ideas, I think, and he thinks that because of his sensitivity to the spirit world, he can see into the future and perceive things that other people cannot by taking the cover off the Spiritus Mundi. Don't really need to know all that to appreciate the poem, and probably the important point is just that his own belief in his powers, the power of the occult, made him a better poet, actually, because he was able to use these tremendous images, this very effective imagery. That's why the poem works so well in terms of memorable phrases, I guess, because it's just full of wonderful imagery. I don't think it's as profound a poem as some of his others, which are more personal, about love or about what, in Sailing to Byzantium, what he will do, what a poet needs to do as he gets older. But it is undoubtedly a great poem, and one of Yeats's best, but probably, in my opinion, not one of the three best poems he wrote. Thank you.